Greetings and welcome to the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. My name is Peter Mandeville, and I'm a senior research fellow at the center. Here at the Berkeley Center, I lead the Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, a multi-year research initiative enabled by generous support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, dedicated to exploring and understanding the various ways that religion fits into the foreign policy and external relations of states and governments around the world. Today's program is part of this project, and we're grateful to you for joining us. We are delighted today to welcome to the Berkeley Center Dr. Claudia Baumgart-Ochse, a senior researcher based at the Peace Research Institute, Frankfurt, Germany. Dr. Baumgart-Ochse's presentation today will explore the topic of Israel's religious soft power. The very nature of the project of founding a national homeland for the Jewish people has, of course, meant that Israel's geopolitical persona has always entailed an important religious dimension. As we will learn today, however, Israel's global religious outreach efforts have not been limited to Jewish communities, and in recent decades have focused quite heavily on specific segments of the American Christian spectrum. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read Dr. Baumgart-Ochse's biography in full. Rather, I will put up in the chat box a link that you can click on in order to peruse her impressive professional profile. I'll also include a link to the main landing page for the Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, where you can learn more about the initiative and also access the wide range of articles, working papers, and video recordings of previous talks associated with the project. We're also excited that in 2021, the project will be publishing not one, but two edited volumes with Oxford University Press, one of which will feature a chapter from today's speaker. Before I hand things over to Dr. Baumgart-Ochse, just a few brief words about logistics and our format for today. I wanted to let you all know that today's session will be recorded for the benefit of people who aren't able to join us for the live presentation, and all of you who registered for the event will receive a link to that recording once it becomes available. After our speaker's presentation, we will have some time available for discussion and Q&A from the audience. If you'd like to participate in that, you can do so by using the Q&A function, which is on the band of Zoom controls, usually at the bottom of your screen. If you click Q&A, that will bring up a sort of chat box into which you can type your question, and I will then pose those questions to our speaker during the Q&A period. So without further ado, let me welcome our speaker for today and hand the floor over to Dr. Baumgart-Ochse.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter, for having me tonight. It's an honor to be part of this series. I have a PowerPoint presentation, which I would like to show you. So I try to get this on now. Just a moment. Well, I want to start with the concept of soft power, obviously. As you all probably know, because you've probably learned about it in previous presentations, soft power is a concept devised by Joseph Nye, and he defined it as the ability of states to set the political agenda and determine the framework of debate in a way that shapes others' preferences. It arises from the attractiveness of a country's culture, political ideas, and policies, and it is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payments. So the opposite of soft power, obviously, is hard power. And he defines hard power as the ability to coerce. And this ability grows out of a country's military and economic might. Now, thinking of Israel, soft power is not the first thing that comes to mind, of course. I found an index that is done by the consultancy Portland, and it's called the Soft Power 30. And here they measure the soft power of different countries. And in the picture, you can see the different components that go into the index, and culture is among them. And so I subsume culture or subsume religion under culture here. And Israel was ranked in 2015 in the first edition of the index as number 26 in the index of 30. But from 2016 on, Israel dropped completely from the index. So not very high ranking in soft power. Instead, Israel, of course, has a lot of hard power. Here I have a chart from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. The Institute publishes an annual report on the military balance and defense spending. And as you can see, Israel, despite being such a small country with a small population by comparison, it ranks number 14 with regard to defense spending in 2019. So you can see it down there. It's the green one, Israel, number 14. Sorry, the purple one. So, of course, that's not a surprising thing that Israel is more into hard power than into soft power. And it has to do, of course, with its history, as Peter already mentioned in his introduction. First of all, the state was established in the wake of European anti-Semitism and in the wake of the Holocaust in the 1940s. So the state places high value on national security in order to avoid a second Holocaust. And you can see this mechanism at work even today in the example, for example, in the conflict with Iran. And this fear of external dangers is secondly due to a series of conflicts and wars which Israel fought with its Arab neighbors and with the Palestinians since its establishment. Here I have a quote from Asher Arian, who did a lot of surveys regarding Israeli security. And he says, on the symbolic and psychological levels, there are the Almighty and the Jewish people. On the level of rationality and professionalism, there are the Israel Defense Forces, the Mossad, the Shin Bet Kaf, and Israel's other security institutions. Together, they make up a complex mosaic, which is at the heart of the religion of security. So security is the core concern and not soft power. However, I'm making the counterintuitive claim, if you will, that Israel does in fact employ soft power, and it does employ religious soft power. I argue that Israel uses soft power in order to influence two important civil society groups in the United States: the American Jewish community on the one hand, and American evangelicals, or Christian Zionists as they're called, in the US. The US is of course the most important ally for the Israeli government. So it seeks to garner support from American civil society in order to influence the US administration's policies towards Israel. However, so far in the literature, the perspective is taken that the civil society groups are the ones who actively seek the relationship with the US administration and seek to influence that. So it's the perspective is always from the civil society organizations and how they influence Israel by way of influencing the US administration. In my paper, or in my presentation today, I make the claim that the Israeli government also has a role in this and does try to influence these two communities in the United States. So let's start with the American Jewish community. In 2019, there were about 5.7 million US American Jews. Some estimate even more, it depends on how you count. And from comparison, Israel reached 9 million inhabitants in 2019, I think in March 2019. And of that were 6.6 million Jewish Israelis. American Jewish Jews have, of course, a strong connection to Israel. Dov Waxman, in his book, calls it the phenomenon of Israelism, and he says it consists of 4 pillars. The first pillar is familism, which is a deep sense of kinship and solidarity among Jews. The second one is functionality, the love for Israel as a substitute religion for many American Jews. It gives them the possibility to be Jewish without being religious. And of course, faith. Waxman says that the more religious you are, the stronger your bond to Israel is, because Israel, of course, has a very deep religious meaning for many Jews as God's promised land. And the last point is fantasy, because until today, still many Jews have a, well, romantic or idealistic image of Israel, which not always is in touch with the reality on the ground. So familism, functionality, faith, and fantasy. And I have that from Dov Waxman. Now, in the early phase, American Jews strongly supported the establishment of the state, with money, with lobbying, all means at their hands. However, the Americans were a little irritated because the Zionist leadership in Israel very openly called for immigration to Israel. And of course, American Jews traditionally have a very strong connection to their homeland and they're very loyal to their homeland, America. So this caused some disagreement. But David Ben-Gurion, then Prime Minister of Israel, sought an agreement with Jacob Blaustein from the American Jewish Committee. And it was kind of swap. They exchanged restraint on side of the Zionist leadership in exchange for support from the American Jewish community. So that happened in 1950. Well, such efforts were not really necessary after 1967, because then, and here I cite Waxman again, the widespread fear of a second Holocaust prior to the war, followed by the relief and jubilation felt after Israel's swift and stunning victory, led to a spontaneous outpouring of support for Israel for the American Jews. I'm sorry, that was I don't know if you heard that, but that was my daughter in the background. Anyway, so since the 1970s, some American Jews grew more skeptical, especially when the right-wing expansionist Likud government came to power and Israel didn't match their image of a democratic, egalitarian, peace-loving country, which they envisioned. So it's going down again a little bit. And since the 1980s, it's becoming ever more complicated because few major organizations channeled US-American Jewish support for Israel until then. But then we see a process of pluralization and even polarization. And of course, the bone of contention is the conflict with the Palestinians and events such as the harsh crackdown on the first Intifada or the massacre in Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon. So since late 1970s, more critical view of Israel in the American Jewish community. And then I have all these arrows going in all directions because there was no a single consensus anymore. And the bone of contention, as I think I said that, was of course the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Right, so how did Israel use its soft powers? Well, in the first decades, there was not so much necessary, but government officials, of course, regularly addressed the major Jewish organizations, and the Blaustein Agreement is an example of how Israeli officials sought to maintain this support. The Diaspora Ministry, the Jewish Agency, handled huge amounts of donations, and so that was it until the 1980s. But then this American Jewish romance, as Finkelstein has called it, wanes or starts to wane, and there's a change in the models used from mass mobilization through the central organizations like American Jewish Committee to more direct engagement with the heterogeneous scene of Jewish organizations in the US. Well, a very noteworthy effort on part of the Israeli government is the program is called Taglit, Birthright Israel. And Taglit brings young Jewish adults to Israel for 10-day educational trips. And these are funded by the Israeli government as well as by private donors. And it's perhaps the most successful tool of religious soft power in the American Jewish community. So from the website, I brought you a quote, and it says, Birthright Israel seeks to ensure the future of the Jewish people by strengthening Jewish identity, Jewish communities, and connection with Israel via a trip to Israel for the majority of Jewish young adults from around the world. Our hope is that our trips motivate young people to continue to explore their Jewish identity and support for Israel and maintain long-lasting connections with the Israelis they meet on their trip. It's a very interesting program, and in the literature it's called diasporization through homeland tourism. More than 750,000 participants have already been part of such a trip. And the core themes of these educational journeys are the narratives of the Jewish people, contemporary Israel, and the ideas and values of the Jewish people. So visiting all these places in Israel allows for a physical experience of Israel as a second homeland, as a parallel homeland to their land of residence. And these trips seek to form a group identity among participants and develop a narrative of dispersion. Most interesting for our purpose here is the use of secular and also religious rituals, such as lighting candles at Shabbat, prayers at the Western Wall, or group blessings on top of Masada in the Negev. Right, so time's running up, and we have had this well, not nice interruption. So I'm turning to the second group, and that's American evangelicals. I have a few quotes here from the Pew Research Center. Obviously, Israel is very important for American evangelicals, so much so that the term Christian Zionism is used for this portion of evangelicals, which passionately support the state of Israel. And you see these quotes from a study from 2013. 82% of evangelicals believe that Israel was given to the Jewish people by God, more than double the percentage of American Jews who held this belief. And from 2019, you see that 43% of American Jews say that Trump is favoring Israelis too much, and about the same percentage say he's striking the right balance between Israelis and Palestinians. By contrast, 72% of evangelical Protestants say they think Trump strikes the right balance between the Israelis and Palestinians, and 15% say that Trump favors Israel too much. So, of course, American evangelicals make a big part of the American constituency. So both political parties in the US seem to compete among each other, who is more Israel friendly than the other. And Trump particularly rallied the evangelicals prior to the elections, in part by allowing for annexation of the West Bank in his deal of the century, or of parts of the West Bank. Well, in the literature, the focus is mostly on religious ideas when explaining the strong support of evangelicals for Israel. There are, on the one hand, apocalyptic theories. You might have heard the term of premillennial dispensationalism. I tell you, for Germans, it's even difficult to pronounce. So in this theological idea, the Jewish people has a decisive role in end times. And this is contrary to the previous replacement theology, where the church was thought to replace the Jewish people as in God's favor. So premillennial dispensationalism instead gives the Jewish people a very important role in the end times. However, not everybody is very much into apocalyptic theories. So for many Christians in the US, the biblical commandment, the simple biblical commandment of blessing Israel is very important, as it is in Genesis 12:3 in the Bible. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So this ethical or moral imperative is very important and unites much of Christian Zionist support for Israel. So this, contrary to this strong emphasis on religious ideas, there's a brilliant book by Daniel G. Hummel, Covenant Brothers, and he says that religious ideas are not sufficient to explain the amount of support that comes from the evangelical community. And he says this support is a product of advocacy, organizing, and cooperation beginning after 1948 and advancing significantly in the wake of the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. And I want to quote from his work, because I couldn't say it better. The rise of the Christian Zionist movement required strategic leadership, theological interreligious cooperation, political mobilization, and state-to-state diplomacy. Outside actors, and I have highlighted this here, the government of Israel, chief among them, have been constitutive to creating modern evangelical Christian Zionism and, by extension, modern conservative evangelical politics. So, and again, the question, how did they do that? So when Douglas G. Young founded the American American Holy Land Institute, the Israelis were at first a little skeptical because they feared that he would missionize or evangelize Jews. But soon after they found out that Douglas Young, of course, followed dispensational theology, so there was no danger of being proselytized. And the Israeli government began to strongly support the Institute and also Douglas Young himself. For example, the tourism ministry sponsored lecture tours to the US by Young, where he tried to bring to the US community the tangible politics of dispensational theology. After 1967, evangelical support became even more important because other mainline churches and Catholic Church became more critical of Israel and the occupation. So after 1967, an official from foreign ministry visited US theological seminaries, and in the conservative seminaries, he found much dispensational theology, but not many ideas about how they related to political realities on the ground. So what they did then was try to convey the message of how important the land of Israel really is for the Jewish self-understanding. So the Israeli government strengthened Jewish-Christian interreligious dialogue in order to convey this message. And they strengthened their ties to many Christian organizations in the US. In 1971, there was a Bible prophecy conference in Jerusalem, and they gathered about 1,400 Christian Americans. And even former Prime Minister Ben-Gurion addressed the audience, and he explained to them this importance of the land for the Jewish people, the land and the state of Israel. So this conference helped spur two very important developments later on. The one is large-scale evangelical tourism to Israel, as well as a close alliance between Likud, but also Avodah and the Christian Zionists in America. What is interesting is that the Israeli government uses the same tool of religious soft power as in the case of American Jews. So they started to bring evangelical pastors free of charge to Israel. Following that, the number of Holy Land tours organized by private Christian organizers, as well as larger organizations such as the International Christian Embassy, grew steadily. The Ministry of Tourism acted as a kind of gatekeeper, sidelining organizations which didn't match their ideas and developed Holy Land tourism strategies. Sorry. So the whole thing of this tour bus diplomacy allowed for a direct experience of the land of Israel, and it allowed for disseminating a specific ideological religious framing of this encounter. And it's very, very similar to the same religious soft power tool used among American Jews. So in addition to tourism, of course, Israel's officials kept reaching out to the American evangelical communities in the highest echelons of power. Just think of Golda Meir, who maintained contacts with Billy Graham, who was close to Nixon, which helped Golda Meir in her policies. Menachem Begin had a close relationship with Jerry Falwell. And just recently, Netanyahu spoke in front of Christians United for Israel, which is currently the most important Christian organization in support of Israel today. And it's directed by John Hagee, who's here in the picture. So I come to my conclusion. So Israel, of course, is the geographic home of two world religions, and it makes use of this religious soft power in order to garner support of both American Jews and Christian Zionists in the US. Standing out are the programs of tour bus diplomacy, where religious soft power becomes an effective tool to keep the flame of love for Israel burning. And I end here, and I'm very sorry for...
We already have some questions that have come in through the chat box, and I will invite all of you in the audience to start thinking about what you would like to ask our speaker. One of the questions that comes in actually is very closely related to one that I had wanted to ask you, so I'll perhaps start with that. You have, of course, naturally focused and appropriately focused primarily on Israel's religious soft power vis-a-vis the United States. Um, of course, there are Jewish communities in other regions of the world and potentially other religious groups that Israel may wish to engage with or see some geopolitical value in engaging with. And so I wanted to
Mhm.
ask you if you could share any insight that you have about whether and how Israel has engaged in religious soft power outreach in other regions of the world, perhaps even comparing it with the European case. And this is
Mm.
closely connected, as I mentioned, to a question that came in from Manuel Ferez, who says, what about Israel's soft power in other countries? Would be very interesting or great to see how projects like the Taglit work for example, Latin America.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. To be honest, I haven't researched that, so I don't have like the details on it. But of course, for example, the Taglit program operates in many countries in the world. So of course, in Germany, in Latin America, in France. So the main percentage of participants does come from the US, but it works in many countries of the world. I think I focused on the US because the communities there are just so strong. And they are so strong in support of Israel, and of course they are so large. So the same is true with evangelical Christians. But of course, you find, for example, in Brazil, strong communities, evangelical communities in strong support of Israel, with very or Pentecostal communities in strong support for Israel. So yeah, I mean, there's also religious soft powers into other countries in the world. However, the US is, of course, the most important ally for Israel. So I think it pours most of its energy into the US scene.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just noticing also that another related question popped up from Michael Mwangi, who asked about how Israeli religious soft power works outside the US, particularly in Christian Europe. Is there anything on sub-Saharan Africa that you have to share?
No, I'm sorry. Sub-Saharan Africa, not really on my. No, I'm sorry. I have to pass on that one. But I mean, in Europe, just to say something about Europe, in Europe,
Please.
of course, the mainline churches, well, first thing, mainline churches are much more important, like Catholic and Protestant churches, than evangelicals. Evangelicals or conservative evangelicals in Europe are rather a small group. So that is very different to the American scene, where the evangelicals, of course, make up a much larger portion of Christians in the US. And the mainline churches are not as dominant as in Europe. Second point is that even the mainline churches, of course, in Europe lose in significance because of secularization, which is on the individual level much stronger in Europe than in the US. I mean, that's a very prominent topic in sociology of religion, that we have this US-Europe divide. So of course, religion plays a much lesser part in Europe, and also in diplomacy or in soft power than towards the US. Okay. Even in Baptist circles in Germany or in the evangelical circles, you don't find much of dispensational theology in its full blossom as you find it in the US.
Okay, great. Questions coming in now thick and fast. Let me go to one of the first to come in from Gianpaolo Pezzi, who asks, how does the consciousness of being a chosen people still influence the soft power of Israel? Is that still a dimension of Israel's geopolitical persona and identity?
Yes, I think so. It is. I mean, Israel is still a very religious country with many, many people who believe in God and who are religious and practicing their religion. There's, of course, also a large portion which is completely secular and only in a cultural way, maybe Jewish. But of course, there's a strong religious overtone. And it also is still a theme in politics. And this being chosen does not necessarily lead to a feeling of being somehow superior. It can also mean bringing good to the world, like tikkun olam. That's the concept of doing the world something good. So yeah, it's still there. And of course, the geographical situation, the feeling of being surrounded by hostile countries strengthens this feeling of being chosen and somehow being special and being in a situation as no other country in the world is. Being a democracy all alone in this hostile environment also adds to this feeling of being chosen, being something special.
Okay, great, thank you. Moving on now to a question from Denise Monzani da Rocha, who thanks you for the presentation and
You're welcome.
And asks whether and how do Israeli settler communities fit into this picture?
That's a very good question. Well, there are strong connections, most interestingly, between the settler community and also between the settler community and not only to American Jews, but also to American Zionists. I mean, you will find programs where Christian Zionists travel to Israel in order to help out in Jewish settlements in the occupied territories, to farm lands or to, I don't know, to paint houses or. So it's you also have this in Germany, by the way, in some of the evangelical, in some part of the evangelical communities, a very strong connection between Christian Zionists and the settlers.
Okay, great. Here's a question from Cora Alder at CSS and ETH Zurich, a great friend of the project. Cora, it's very good to see you. She starts by offering you vielen Dank for the presentation. She says, I'd be interested to know more about the objectives of the Homeland Tourism work. Is the main aim to foster affection towards Israel of Jews living in the US and therefore prioritizing US-Israeli relations in US foreign policy? Or is it rather to shift their national alliance or patriotism from the US to Israel by becoming citizens of Israel? And is there any data on how successful, particularly the latter dimension of this work has been?
I think the latter dimension nowadays is more in the background, because like these open calls for immigration, especially in the US, but also in Europe, have always stirred criticism by the Jewish organizations abroad. So it's gone into the background because they recognize that they don't do themselves any good if they call for immigration, because then they make Americans or European Jews feel like the fifth column, like illoyal to their home, to their states of residence. So I think that's more in the background. The other thing is more important. I think it's all about creating a certain image of Israel, which then leads to support Israel and Israeli government policies. I mean, it's not supporting Israel, it's supporting Israeli government policies. And of course, these communities are huge constituencies in America, and they vote, and they're important, and their vote is important. So if you want to have an US-American policy toward Israel that fits your own policies, then as an Israeli government, you try to influence these communities. So yeah, these programs are well designed to achieve that. And they say so on their website in the quote I gave you.
Yeah, they're quite open about it in that respect. Yeah. Just picking up on the last part of Cora's question, what's your sense of how successful this kind of work has been?
I think it's hugely successful. I mean, just look at the strong support for Israel today, both in, I mean, well, maybe less in the American Jewish community because they're even more critical, but for sure in the evangelical community. I think that is they've been very successful. So you see these, I mean, I gave you the numbers from the Pew Research Center, just the percentage of evangelicals who believe that Israel is the promised land, that the Jews are the chosen people, and that they play a role in the end times, and so that U.S. American foreign policy has to support the Jewish state. So I think that's very strong, and so they are successful. Yes.
Okay, great. Here's a question, a very interesting question regarding the relationship between Israel and the Roman Catholic Church. It comes from Gavin DaCosta, who thanks you for the presentation and mentions that since 1965, with the Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council, there are perhaps signs of Catholic support for Israel based on changes to Catholic teaching around the idea that God does not go back on his covenantal promise with his people. And he connects that to the 1993 fundamental agreement between the Vatican and Israel. And he asks, how has Israel picked up on this change, if at all, within Catholic culture?
Again, it was not part of my more detailed research of the Catholic Church and how they react. But of course, I mean, in Catholic teaching, it's often about supporting the weak. Right, so that's just as a general theme. Supporting the weak is very important. So and if they look at Israel today, the weak ones obviously are the Palestinians living under occupation, being suppressed, with restricted mobility and everything you know about how the occupation works on the ground. So for Catholics, often this means these are the weak ones. So these are the ones we have to support because Jesus teaches us to support the weak ones. So I think it's for Israel. It's a tough nut to crack. I mean, the Catholic Church really is the tough nut because if you take organizations like Pax Christi or others who are very active and work, and I once talked to a German Lutheran pastor, and he said if how did he say it? I have to translate it to English. He said if the German Protestants come to how was it? Now, if the Catholics come to Israel, they come through this lens of helping the weak. And if the German Protestants come, they come more through the gate of Yad Vashem and the Holocaust. So they are more on the side of Israel, and the Catholics come more from the side of ethical caring for the weak. So that's a big difference. So it's a tough nut to crack.
Okay, well, the focus on the Vatican in that question actually gives me a perfect opportunity to just point out that in the chat box, I just put in some information about the next webinar presentation in this series, which will be Professor Timothy Burns from Colgate University, talking about the papacy, past and present, religious soft power, and international diplomacy. So that might be another opportunity to ask a version of the same question. Claudia, I'm afraid the next question also has a Catholic dimension to it. This is from Maximiliane Linde, who says, thank you very much. We all know that the US-Israel relationship will change under Biden, but do you think one reason for that will be that Biden is Catholic and is not fraternizing with conservative evangelicals in the same way that Trump did?
That's a very interesting question. And I tend to say yes. I tend to say yes. I think, I mean, you're in the US, you're obviously in a much better position to judge on Biden and his policies. But yeah, I think that's very plausible that Biden, because he's Catholic, he's not as close to the evangelicals. He still has to court them because, as I said, they are voters, they're a big constituency, and you have to somehow get them on your side, or at least cater to them in some sense. But yeah, I think he's a little more distance to that. And he's a Democrat. So the combination of being Catholic and Democrat might actually help a lot in that respect.
Okay. So this is a question from Philip Odi, who thanks you for the presentation. Says, my question is about the use of Israeli soft power to promote Islamophobia within North America. Have you come across this in your research? Do you have any suggestions on how to combat Islamophobic rhetoric coming from soft power groups within the Jewish community?
To be honest, I haven't come across that, at least not in literature pertaining to what I just refer to. It's a very interesting. I mean, Islamophobia in itself is a very interesting topic, but I haven't come across that. But maybe the one who asked the question has, in case this can say something in another Q&A answer. Probably he knows more than I do, which is, well, it's well possible.
Thanks. So next question comes from another participant in the project, Rob Blitt, who very interestingly turns us to the question of the domestic political spectrum within Israel itself. He says, how about within the ever-evolving Israeli political spectrum? Among the more secular-leaning parties, can you identify a different or a lesser interest in using this type of religious soft power? In other words, is the use of religious soft power a bipartisan or cross-partisan strategy within Israel?
Mm-hmm. Actually, I think it's bipartisan. I think that both parties are involved in that. Likud probably always had a even stronger connection to the conservative Christian Zionists, but both parties engage in that because there is still this consensus that that they need the US, and so yeah, that's very strong. But of course, on the margins, I mean, you have there's this, again, a brilliant book by Atalia Omer on a new movement coming up, young Jewish American activists who are joining they call it Jewish Solidarity Movement or she calls it a Jewish Solidarity Movement for the Palestinians. And of course, there are connections to some on the Israeli left. But as we all know, the Israeli left in Israel is really, well, very small nowadays. So that's really on the margins, I think, but it's important, and maybe something evolves out of that.
Okay, thank you. Our next question comes from Barbara Rosenberg, and I think in some ways picks up from precisely the last point you were making. Barbara is asking how Israel squares its outreach, its religious outreach in the US, when many American Jews are increasingly liberal and bothered by the politics of the Likud. Mm-hmm. If I can phrase it in a different way, I guess she's asking, is there not, in heavily courting conservative evangelical Christians, is Israel not risking losing some of its core support from the American Jewish community?
Yeah, probably yes, but I think they try to get what they can. I mean, as I said in the presentation, since the 1980s, the American Jewish community is far more divided, even polarized, over the issue of the conflict with the Palestinians. So they have lost much ground there already. So maybe it's not, not such a bad idea to then really invest in the relationship to Christian Zionists. So I don't think it's that they're calculating that they're losing even more on the American Jews. I think they invest in both communities quite a bit.
Okay, here's a question from Hannah Klingenborg, who says, you talked about Israel's soft power toward Christian countries or communities. Do you know how much of it, in the meanwhile, affects mostly Muslim majority countries? Does it, for example, play a role in the growing ties or relationships between parts of the Arab world and Israel? Mm-hmm. Obviously, we have recently had the so-called Abraham Accords to signal rapprochement between a subset of Arab countries and Israel. Is there a religious dimension there?
I don't see much of a religious dimension there. What I see in the Abraham Accords is more a dimension of forging a coalition against Iran, a regional coalition against Iran. I mean, that's now very blunt, but of course they were called Abraham Accords, and I think Trump probably liked this idea of presenting a deal which brings together the religions, Muslim religion, Islamic religion, and Jewish religion in the Christian US. So that's how you come up with the name Abraham Accords. But of course, it's first of all the coalition against Iran, because Iran is seen as the main danger, not only to Israel but also to especially to the Gulf states, the main contender. And secondly, it's also pure economic interests. because they share a lot of technology. Now they even share technology regarding to the Corona pandemic and vaccinations and stuff. So it's economic and political, but not so much religious, I'm afraid.
Okay. Our next question also circles back to the domestic realm of Israel and the kind of religious landscape there. To what extent do Haredi Jews in Israel, with their disavowal of Zionism, maintain links with like-minded Jews in the US? And do these links in any way undermine Israel's religious soft power efforts?
Well, the percentage of Haredi Jews that really disavow Israel has shrunken considerably, I think, in recent decades. They were much more, and I think now they are less. And what we see is rather more a convergence of Haredi and settler communities. So I think that they are, well, not convergence, but they're coming ever closer. So I think it's not as clear cut as it used to be, like in the 50s or 60s. And they are too small to undermine that kind of politics. So they're just too small. I mean, the size of that is, I think, to my mind, is too small. But maybe you have a different opinion on that.
So we've got a second question from Cora Alder now, who, again, staying with the theme of Israeli domestic politics, she asks, taking into account the recent struggle to form a functioning government, do you expect any changes or alterations in Israel's approach to religious soft power after March 23rd?
No, not really. I mean, the program like Taglit Birthright Israel, the program is running now for 15, 16 years or something, or even longer. And the connections to Christian Zionism are almost as old as the state. So I don't think we will see much alteration there.
Okay. There's another question from Manuel Ferez, and there's one dimension of it that I thought interesting because it kind of gets at, to some extent, almost the technical modalities of projecting religious soft power. He's asking what role Israeli embassies play in this. Is there an actual role for formal diplomats, or is the sort of ecosystem of relevant actors kind of, does this take the form of public-private partnership, something like that? Is this how is the work institutionally and organizationally structured?
Mm-hmm. Well, it depends on which audience or which constituency you are targeting. So in the case of the American Jewish community, you have this, for example, this in tourism, you have this Taglit Birthright organization, and they are in charge. So they come up with the schedules for these journeys. There are private organizations who do the actual tours and programs, and have tour guides so they're private organizations or businesses. But the whole program and the whole programming and strategies for these tours comes from this organization. With Holy Land tourism, it's different because that is also also not initiated, but it's also supported by the Jewish state, of course, through, for example, Ministry of Tourism. But it's far more heterogeneous scene, even more private. The embassies abroad, I don't think they have a big role in that. I think they mostly hold on to diplomatic kind of exchanges. At least I don't know. I know nothing about that.
Okay. And this, I think, will probably be the final question that we have time for today. I'm gonna, if Denise Monzani da Rocha, this is the second question from her. If she doesn't mind, I'm going to paraphrase it a bit and kind of link it to a forward-looking question. Obviously, your presentation has made very clear how Israel benefits from the use of religious soft power, but I wonder if you might speak to any tensions or downsides for Israel that you perceive in the use of this strategy? That's one part of the question. And the second is just to, invite you at the end of our time together today to kind of look ahead and kind of share some thoughts on what you see as the potential future. Is this simply going to continue to be a mainstay, a fairly institutionalized dimension of Israel's external relations, or do you foresee any circumstances that might, lead to an increase or decrease, or a change in the way that Israel thinks about using religious soft power?
From the perspective of the Israeli government, using religious soft power is very beneficial, because it really helps to maintain this image of Israel, which they want to convey to the US public. So from their perspective, it's of course, I mean, it's very beneficial. If I step out of their perspective, and if you ask my perspective, I think it's not very beneficial, because it of course cements or strengthens or fortifies this certain image, which is always also sometimes in the way of peace, because it's this image of Israel which is probably doing a legitimate occupation, which is problematic for finding peace. So if you step aside and look at it from my perspective, or from an observer's perspective, it's probably problematic. So last bit was like looking ahead. I don't see that they will give up on this kind of programs and policies, because they've been so successful in the previous years. So I strongly believe they will go on with that. I mean, if you look at the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you can scroll through all the speeches that Netanyahu and other high officials give in the US, and many of them are either in front of American Jewish organizations or Christian Zionist organizations. So they travel there, or nowadays they go online and give speeches and welcome addresses and stuff like that. Reuven Rivlin, Netanyahu, well, everybody comes and talks to them. So I think it will go on like that, because it is beneficial to them.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've reached the end of our time today. I want to first and foremost thank our speaker, Dr. Baumgart-Ochse, for her great presentation and for prompting, obviously, such a rich and engaging discussion, as we could see from the great number of questions we had. I also wanted to once again make you aware of the next webinar session in the series. Next month, on Friday, March 12th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, Professor Timothy A. Burns from Colgate University will be presenting on the papacy past and present, religious soft power and international diplomacy. So please mark your calendars, look for event registration info soon, or better yet, sign up to receive event notifications from the Berkeley Center, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for that discussion. My thanks as ever to Ruth Gopin, who coordinates all our events here at the Berkeley Center, and to all the rest of the center staff for making these sessions possible. And finally, let me join the Berkeley Center's director and managing director, Sean Casey and Michael Kessler, in thanking all of you for joining us today. Take care, and we hope to see you soon at another one of our events. Bye-bye, everyone.